Okay, so here we are. Welcome to Convu 104, how to complete a Convu. So as you might expect, when we look at the Convu map, there's the first stage, which is opening the gap that we've talked about in some detail. And then there is generating insight and taking action. So today's video is going to be about those latter two stages and some of the things that come up. I want to emphasize that that can happen over multiple conversations. So you're not expected to necessarily go through the full arc in one conversation. I'm going to focus on the job of the host in this video, and particularly the mindset that the host can bring as he or she helps the guest through these stages of learning. And I want to emphasize that I am not going to offer a specific recipe for how to generate insight. So, for example, there are techniques using immunity to change, or there's a grow model for coaching, and I could go on and on. And depending on what the topic is, there might be a specific approach or method that would be really helpful. A lot of us are having conversations about race, same group conversations or cross group conversations, and there are approaches and protocols that help for that. Or people might be thinking about their careers, or you might be thinking about difficult conversations or negotiations, and all of those have their own sort of right approach, if you will. I'm going to call those like applications that run on top of an operating system, and that if we get the operating system right, then whatever approaches or methods we use will be more effective. I did want to offer an example of why the operating system matters. This comes up a lot in negotiations. So it's a whole field of negotiation. People learn techniques and tips and how to kind of get the best out of the negotiation that's possible. And there's a very interesting program called the Program on Negotiation at Harvard that kind of runs out of the law school there, and you may be familiar with Getting to Yes and Difficult Conversations or not, but there's been a sort of a series, an evolution of that program that recognize that whatever the techniques or methods that you're using, there is an underlying quality of the relationship that an intention that you're bringing to the negotiations that has a really huge impact. So it's almost like, if you have a great set of questions that you can ask, they'll work in one case but not in another, and it depends a lot on your intention. And you can see how that would be if you go into a negotiation and your basic intention is, I want to screw this person over and get the most for myself that I possibly can. And if I can pull a fast one, I will. And so my intention is going to be to look for opportunities to exploit them. So when that's happening, you bring a certain energy, and you wouldn't be surprised if the other person went on the defensive. And the evidence is overwhelming that that's what happens. People sense it, it kind of leaks out, and they're on the defensive. So the quality of the information is less. There's very little creativity and collaboration, and you reach a deadlock more quickly. Conversely, if you came in wondering, what don't I know? What don't I see? What could I learn? And how could we maximize the benefit to all parties? And you bring that kind of curiosity and openness, and what's more, a kind of willingness to collaborate, like, if we could get on the same page about certain things and have a shared intention, then maybe it would go better. You can imagine that would yield higher quality information, a sense of openness and willingness to trust each other, and consequently you could generate much better outcomes in your negotiation, more creative ideas and solutions. So basically the same is true in many other domains, including Convus, that the intention you bring and the quality of your intention as it's sustained through the conversation has a huge impact and is in many ways more important than the specific technique or method. So that's why we're focusing on this sort of OS level. And I will acknowledge up front that this will leave a lot of questions unanswered. Like, I'm not offering the same 6 steps to opening a gap for generating insight or taking action at this point. And I'd rather see what questions come up for you and what you kind of know intuitively how to do. Also allow for the gifts and the knowledge that you already have. So there's a wide spectrum of experience in the group, and you should feel welcome as a host to draw on your experience, on your ideas, on your intuitions, and we'll be talking about in what spirit or how you can do that. So I wanted to leave the field really wide open in terms of methods, but focus on the intention and the operating system, if you will. So the way I propose to organize it is I'm going to talk about a temptation in the phase of generating insight, and then a temptation in the phase of taking action, and how the host can kind of hold steady in the face of those temptations that could kind of knock them off. So the temptation in the generate insight phase is to know better. And I want to offer a story related to that. So when I was learning how to coach, one of the programs was with Julio Olaya of Newfield Network. And one of his signatures is that he says, I'm going to offer you very little content, but you're going to practice a lot and you're going to learn from your experience. So he had us do an exercise pretty early on where the person we're coaching has their back to the stage, to the front of the room, and Julio would hold up a big sign that was a cue for the coach. So the curious thing was, in this conversation, you actually weren't saying anything, and the coachee was kind of telling their story. They would start out, well, my problem is, and they would talk, and you as the coach would just sit there silently. Okay, so there was a first cue which said, you know better. So what it did is it prompted the part of you that was listening almost skeptically and that already knew what the solution was and, you know, what this person's, etc. You can picture. And so that went on for several minutes. And then they changed the cue and started over and did a second session where the cue was, this person has the resources to figure it out for themselves. And you are, I think, admire their resourcefulness. You are admiring their resourcefulness. And so we ran that, and then they debriefed and they asked the coachees, well, could they tell, was there any difference in their experience of the coach sitting there silently with a particular mindset? And it was pretty amazing. I mean, there really was a difference, and people felt much more open and resourceful in the second case. That kind of blew me away, and I started noticing in, you know, my professional experience the power of the stance, if you will, of admiring the resourcefulness and potential of the person. Sometimes the potential that they don't even notice themselves. So I wanted to share that experience and also share that part of the challenge for us is, you know, we're wired as human beings. So there we are, you're in the conversation, you're listening, the person's telling you the story, they're telling you the problem, they're, you know, expressing maybe some frustration or dissatisfaction, and automatically we're seeing patterns. And automatically when we see a pattern that sort of comes together to a, like say 80% resolution, then we go, we lock in. That's it. I understand now. And oh, that reminds me of a solution to that problem. And to the degree that we felt uncomfortable being exposed to the problem, we're attached to knowing the solution and being able to turn the page and say, oh, well, that one's solved. Here's how you're going to handle it. And that temptation, that, we're wired for that, and it's quite functional in some ways, but it also undermines our ability to stay curious and sort of be with. Specifically, it undermines our ability to pace. So everything here that has to do with, staying with them and really hearing them is at stake and actually at risk when you fall under this spell of believing that you know better. And I will mention, we're going to get some nice background sound here. Kids are playing great music down there. I want to quote from Daniel Kahneman, who did a lot of research on behavioral economics. He's famous for understanding how people believe their own intuitions and how often they are inaccurate and why. So he evokes the sort of hindsight bias. He quotes someone who did a lot of research on that and says, we cannot suppress the powerful intuition that what makes sense in hindsight today was predictable yesterday. And what's at work here is a powerful rule, what he calls what you see is all there is. So it's because our mind operates as if what we see is all there is. And he says you build the best possible story from the information available to you, and if it's a good story, you believe it. Paradoxically, it's easier to construct a coherent story when you know little, when there are fewer pieces to fit the puzzle. Our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. So I love the irony and the power, really, of that insight, which is just how we're wired. We look for coherence, and we ignore or overlook the things that we might be missing. So, of course, when it comes to being in a convu with someone, that creates a certain risk or a challenge. So what happens in practice? We get, just to review, we get mesmerized, we get kind of entranced by our own sense of coherence. We think that our story must be true, and then we start to discount and dismiss information that's inconsistent with that story, and we forget to ask ourselves what we could be missing. So imagine that's happening. What's the impact on the guest? Well, you can imagine we might start to overlead. So now on the Convu map, you're spending too much time over here sort of getting wrapped up in your idea of what's happening, and you're actually losing track that they're behind you, not following and not connected to your own story. And that disconnection creates a suboptimal flow. You start to lose the sound of learning. So obviously the remedy for that is to return to pacing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I also want to pause here and say that what we're talking about is a real dilemma, because it wouldn't work for you to just suppress your ideas and your understanding of what's going on. Josephine, my daughter, had a nice phrase. So how can my opinions nourish, not dominate the conversation? And you wouldn't want to sacrifice the nourishment. You just want to find that middle way. So, just like the river is a middle way, that's the challenge here, of kind of find that balance where you can bring in your thoughts and reactions, your intuitions. You can be present in the conversation, and for that matter, caring. I mean, this is an expression of caring, that you want to offer a solution or an interpretation, but not do so in a way where you get carried away and disconnect. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so that's the dilemma. Number one, you're giving them space to process and to assess your interpretation. And number two, you're staying open and curious even as you're formulating it. So specifically, you can follow the following steps. So first step would be, say, okay, I want to offer you an interpretation, or it could be a framework or a theory or a proposition, and you can take it or leave it. So that's what you say to the guest. You frame it not as God's truth, but as something that they are then going to take on and consider. Second step, very important, keep it short. Try to boil it down. Resist the temptation to elaborate, like I'm doing now. and then third, ask for their reaction, and then just be quiet and listen. Take it in. If you're really good, then even as you're explaining briefly, you're also observing. So now you're splitting your attention so that you're saying what makes sense to you and offering it to them, but also really paying attention. How are they reacting? How are they taking it in? Is it too much? Is it too little? And then as soon as you can, just ease up and open the space for them, and then just listen. Okay, so now let's talk about the temptation that happens in the third stage, the take action stage. Basically, that temptation is to tell the person what to do. So what happens in the third stage is your guest has generated some insight, and the insight will have implications. So if you read that piece on how to play the role of coach, and I tell the story of Tiffany, there was a big insight that Tiffany had, which was that in her interactions with her colleagues, especially the higher ups, she wasn't listening. She just kept advocating and trying to convince and kind of show her knowledge. And when she got that insight, it was pretty plain that practicing listening and seeing whether some of her fears would come true or not, and how safe could it be to listen, and what happened, and how would it affect her relationship to them, that was the area she wanted to explore. So now you have the take action. The question is, well, how are you going to explore that? And what's the situation? And what's the commitment? And what resistance is going to come up? And then how do you want to take a stand and make a commitment to work through that resistance, so that when we meet next time, you have something to report and you feel proud of what you've tried. That's the nature of the task in the third stage. Your job as host is first to help them come up with a meaningful commitment, one that they have buy-in around and that they're excited about, because clearly there's something to learn, or there's some strength that they're going to develop out of that. And then once they have that meaningful commitment, to hold them accountable. But now, is it accountable to your expectation and your idea of what they should do, or is it accountable to their promise? I want to offer it's their promise. It's whatever they actually committed to willingly and with a strong sense of joy, with a sense of buy-in. That's when they gave their word, and your job is to help them honor their word. So that's the mindset, and from that mindset, you can actually be confrontational in a very productive way. You can say, well, you said this, but you did that. What happened? And, that could be an occasion for them to say, oh, God, I didn't even realize how much resistance or fear I had around that. Or I learned that I have to do something else first in order to, access that territory, or whatever it is. And that can be very helpful, very powerful, but notice that it's still in service of honoring their word. So obviously, this is a different process than what we may be accustomed to doing in our role as parent, as mentor, as advisor, as manager. or a situation, let's say you're a camp counselor and there's some situation, something has to get done, and boom, you have to come in there and tell people what to do. There is clearly a place for that. But what happens here is different from that, and actually in some ways might inform and help you be a better manager or parent or mentor or any of those other things. But the key is to remember what your job is, what in service of what. So it's in service of their commitment and helping them honor their word. There's going to be a back and forth. This isn't only coming from them. You can have suggestions and ideas for what they could do, but you're always listening for what's the quality of the commitment. What are they? When do you come upon real buy-in? You can hear it in their voice. It's part of the sound of learning. It's like, oh yeah, if I could do that, that would be so cool. So you're listening for that, and you're tuning to them, and you're having them be what guides you, sort of down this river of learning. And you can ask questions like, so, given that insight, what do you want to practice? Or, so you want to get better at that. So what would help you get better at that? Or, okay, but is that a priority? I just want to check. There are other things are going to come up. Is that something that you're really committed to, at least in this time period? So you're validating the quality of the commitment. You're checking, you're listening for that, rather than convincing, cajoling, giving a long list of reasons why they should do this thing, how it's worked for so many of your clients before, how if they just follow your 3 steps to dieting, they're going to lose the weight, and they just have to try harder. Do you see the difference? You're making sure that you're tuning in to their own reactions and their resourcefulness and their knowing of what's going to work, and their recognition of where the sources of resistance or difficulty might be. Then once you get to the accountability piece, it's going to be different questions. It's going to be, so last time we spoke, you said you were going to do X. What happened? How did that go? What did you learn? If the person didn't do it, then why? And again, what did you learn? You can also be an accountability partner in that you can invite them to tell you if there's a breakdown. So maybe it's something that was going to happen just in a couple of days, and if something comes up, they can text you and say, well, something came up. So your job really is in service to them. When you hold them accountable, you're offering that as a gift. That's why sometimes I say, well, what do you want me to ask you about next time? Powerful, meaningful commitments are usually about something that's not easy. You're usually learning something. So the opportunity is to learn from the breakdowns and difficulties. So it's not all about, oh, you're so weak, why didn't you fulfill the commitment? Rather, it's, oh, how interesting. What happened? What do we have to learn? So that you can then recommit and keep the learning going. Just mentioning a few resources. So, of course, there's your Convu map, and you'll notice particularly the middle and the end questions are about those 2 phases. So questioning interpretations and inferences and assumptions, that's about generating insight. Suggesting options and possibilities, introducing new distinctions and frameworks, same thing. Generating insight. Asking, so what? Inviting commitment, that's going to be taking action. And you'll notice that as you get into those latter 2 stages, you'll be more called to do leading and challenging than you were in the first stage. So the overall balance starts to tilt more towards challenge, but your main remedy, if you fall into the temptations we talked about, is going to be to return to pacing. The article that I published on how playing the role of host, it's a little bit long, it's a little bit complicated. It tells a fairly detailed story of one specific coaching engagement. Tiffany but in some ways it will illustrate the stages of learning and how sometimes you look back. Most important is the resource of practicing. So just go for it. Just try it. Be wobbly. Go, find out what's easy, what's hard.